So hi, I guess I should start the talk. Let's do that. Hey, look at that. So I'm Cassidy. I'm here from Spotlight Stories at Google to talk about some work we did on a project last year that was an animated VR short called Age of Sail. Our goal in making this was to make an emotional story, an emotionally genuine story that was visually spectacular and demands to be seen in VR. And we felt that a moving illustration look would be a good way to capture both the emotion and the spectacle. It would also give us the best chance of running well and performantly on all the different devices that we support, because we do everything from tethered VR to mobile VR, 360 video, and also film. Jumping right into the look, the illustrators that we looked at for inspiration to find the visual style, Bernie Fuchs, this is an illustrator who did a lot of work in the 50s and 60s, magazine illustrations and such, a painter. The stuff to note here is all these paintings have a very limited color palette, right? Largely flat colored regions, but they have interesting textures in them. And there's also a subtle edge darkening effect that comes up in a few places. It gives it a real sense of atmosphere. Another one that we looked at was a guy named Thomas Hoyne, totally other end of the spectrum visually. He's much more of a realistic painter, and there's a lot more of an oil paint brushstroke kind of texture to it. But that wasn't so much what we were looking at him for, but for the just the way that he really captures the feeling of being on the open ocean, which is something that is pretty hard to accomplish even in film. And in particular, there's some nice details, like the way that there will be texture that shows up only in shadow, but it gets blown away in the illuminated regions, or vice versa. Another artist that we liked is a guy named Tatsuro Kyuchi. He's a currently active illustrator from Japan. And the thing to note here is, if you look at the way most of the scene is very flat, but there are these indications of texture that come up on things like the sails. So those were some of the things that fed into our production design. What lessons did we try to learn from all of these illustrators? The biggest one was about removing information, right? We all know that you can direct the viewer's attention by being careful with where you put the most interesting and salient details. But knowing that we were going to be doing this in a real-time context and having to do a lot of very complex 3D animation, there are a lot of opportunities for mistakes and errors to come in 3D graphics. And the nice thing about using a strategy of removing information is that you don't have to eliminate all of those mistakes. You just have to make them less interesting than the important stuff in your scene. You're just trying to take these things and push them down, any distracting information, push it down below the threshold of perceivability. And especially in VR, that's going to be important. We would know that we were going to let color do a lot of the work of carrying the story and the mood, so everything would have to be very, very art directable. So this is what we ended up with. Our production designers basically developed all of these ideas into a visual language for the whole show. Some of the key elements of that language: limited color palette, like the Bernie Fuchs paintings, right? There aren't an infinite number of shades of blue in the ocean. There are 4 shades of blue in the ocean. Shadow shapes that serve to unify the entire scene, and they have a kind of a rounded shape to them, so they're not necessarily literally realistic. All of the shapes in the scene have these rough, broken edges to them. And on transitions from lit to shadowed surfaces, wherever a surface is oblique, you have these indications of texture without necessarily rendering the texture everywhere, so only in that kind of liminal zone. So our task for the rendering of this show was to take all of these rules, which are essentially two-dimensional concepts, and translate them into something that would work in 6 Degree of Freedom VR. Why couldn't we use existing techniques to do this for our VR story? I mean, there's been a lot of very sophisticated work done in the field of NPAR, and a lot of it has done a very good job of trying to balance the screen space coherency and consistency of the substrate with the 3D coherence of an animated model. Unfortunately, very few of these are actually suitable for real-time applications. We've got to get our stuff rendering at 90 frames per second. And even fewer even make an attempt to be stereoscopically coherent. So we needed something that was going to hit all four of those qualities at once, and that's why we needed to develop some new things. So first thing I'll talk about is metatexture. Metatexture is basically a way of texturing your objects and having your cake and eating it too. Why did we need it? Well, this is one of the concept paintings by our designer Jasmine Lai. And the thing to note is that this painting, like a lot of the art that we're looking at, has this screen space textural detail. It could be coming from the substrate, like the canvas. It could be coming from the marks themselves, the brush strokes, but these are screen space qualities. And we want every frame of our experience to have those same screen space qualities, but we also want the texture to seem to stick to the objects in the 3D scene, especially in a stereoscopic context. This is an over-constrained problem, right? You can't technically do both of those things in a literal sense, but you can do it well enough to not be, for the errors not to be perceivable by the audience. And so that's where the inspiration for metatexture came from. So imagine you've got a patch of your surface. Why is texture mapping problematic? Well, your texture is going to get squashed and stretched by transformations and deformations of the surface. You're going to get blurry textures when it stretches, you're going to get possibly aliasing when it doesn't, and it's going to be distorted the rest of the time. Well, here's a naive solution. You could just take the texture in UV space and scale it in UV space so that it always matches the screen space proportions that you want it to have. The only problem with that is that now your texture slides around across the surface, so that's not going to be acceptable. So what we can do is still scale it, but quantize the scales at every nearest power of 2. So you find the power of 2 scale that's the closest approximation of what you're trying to get, and then scale it by that. And that's fine, but you get these pops on the transitions. So we blend between them. And because this blending is happening only when the surface is in motion, it's there, but it's more difficult to perceive. So this is basically the root of the approach that we're using in metatexture. Everything else that I'm going to describe is basically an embellishment of this basic idea. So the question is how? How do we know what is the correct UV scale setting to use? Well, we have two different ways to do it. One is to use the derivatives of U and V in screen space. This is available in languages like GLSL and HLSL as a primitive. It has some great advantages because it handles any kind of deformation you want to throw at it. It doesn't matter what transformations you use to get the vertices into position in screen space. The derivatives will always be accurate to where they ended up. The disadvantage is that derivatives are not continuous across the boundaries between triangles, and so you get these artifacts like the kind of hard edges that you see on the bottom there. And also derivatives aren't necessarily implemented on all hardware configurations. So we have an alternate way to do it. You can estimate those screen space derivatives by taking the world space derivatives and combining that information with the normals, the tangents and the binormals of the surface. And this is great. You can do this in the vertex shader, and that means that you can interpolate those values across the triangles, and you get smooth results. That's wonderful. It's also more efficient because you're doing it in vertex instead of it in the fragment level. The disadvantage is this only works if you know the world space derivatives in the first place. And calculating those on the fly could be prohibitively expensive. In our case, we didn't even try it because we were doing this on the ocean where we could assume a constant value across the entire mesh. Now, that wasn't actually strictly true, and what happens when you assume something that isn't true in this case is you get perceivable distortion of the texture. It's stretching and squashing of the texture in 3D space, but that was a trade-off that we were comfortable making. So you're blending up to 4 different textures at every stage of this process because you're blending across 2 U scales and 2 V scales. And that does reduce the contrast and the salience of the texture. So you can use a variance preserving blend operator, and we reference that in the paper if you want to know more details. Not every kind of transformation and distortion that you could experience can be captured just by scaling orthogonally in U or in V. There's also shearing that can happen when those 2 vectors are far from perpendicular to each other in screen space. So the way we compensate for that is we take those vectors and we rotate them in UV space until they're orthogonal in screen space. And then we quantize on those values, which means now we're sampling 8 times per pixel, which means it is more expensive. But it's a trade-off again. So all of this is relative to screen space pixels, and that's assuming that a pixel is a pixel. But of course, in a VR headset, not all pixels are created equal. In particular, the pixels near the center of your field of view subtend a much larger radial angle than the ones off to the side of your field of view. So we have a radial angle component to our computations that we actually use to compensate for that. So put all this together and you've got a pretty good variety of solutions with various trade-offs that you can sort of switch on and off depending on what you need and what kind of devices you're trying to run it on. It runs in real time on a GPU and it handles pretty much any kind of deformation you want to throw at it. And here's how it looks in the context of the ocean in Age of Sail. So on the left, you've got ordinary texture mapping, and you can see it's blown up and stretched out and blurry when you zoom in, and you can see the repetition really obviously when it's zoomed out. But with metatexture, you've got a level of detail that's always consistent, no matter how you look at it. So that's metatexture. Let's talk about edge breakup. This is kind of the second NPAR piece of our look development. So edge breakup is how we roughen the edges of our perfect, pristine CG models like you see in the upper left. And we basically just warp the pixels around using a 2-dimensional vector field that's coming from a noise texture. You don't want to do this using a texture that's just sitting in screen space because then you're going to get the dreaded rippled glass effect. And this is especially problematic if you're looking at your stuff in stereoscopic mode because your visual perception will very accurately spatialize those little deformations to a plane in 3-dimensional space that's sitting in front of your eyes, and it'll make it feel even more like there is a piece of glass there. So not the ideal solution. So you can do it in UV space, do it in object space. And this is basically the technique that we used on a short that we did a couple of years ago called Pearl. And it works pretty well, unless you zoom way in or zoom way out. And then you start to see problems because the texture gets blurry when you zoom in. And that changes the character of that roughened edge. It makes it a wobbly edge instead of a rough edge. And when you zoom out, it can start to buzz and alias. So how do we solve that? Of course, we use metatexture. So this gives you the best of all possible worlds. You've got texture that sticks to the object. It moves with the object. It spatializes correctly in stereo. And as you are transforming and deforming, it handles everything pretty gracefully. Small detail to note. It's important to inflate the object along its normals in screen space so that the edge can be warped beyond the silhouette. It may be hard to see from the back of the room, but this is what it looks like without inflation. And with inflation, you can see that the edges have a more uniform kind of roughness. So without and with, without and with. These red-green textures that we're using to warp the pixels around, they basically just directly encode vectors in screen space. And that means that a red pixel is always going to push your edge in the same direction in screen space, no matter how the object is rotating. So we need a way to compensate for that. Otherwise, the edge is going to change shape as you rotate the camera. So what we do is we rotate those vectors in the shader before we encode them. and we specifically keep them oriented so that the frame of reference is always aligned with the U gradient of the surface. It's not the only way to do it. You could do it along the normal if you want different kinds of effects, but this is what worked for us. If you want boiling edges, it's a simple matter of just offsetting the texture coordinates by a certain amount periodically. One thing you have to watch out for is the heat ripple effect. Now, I've exaggerated it here just so that everyone can see it, but because we're inflating the object for the noise field, if you have something very, very contrasty and detailed behind the object you're rendering, it will seem to get distorted by that vector field. In practice, we have found that it almost never is even remotely noticeable in the experience on Age of Sail, but it is a limitation of the technique, and so you would need to compensate for it in other ways if you did run into that situation. If you apply the same amount of noise to the entire scene, then small details that are important, like the facial features of your character, can get lost when the character gets too far away from the camera. So what you can do is actually have that the intensity of the warping noise get reduced with distance, and that is something that can be controlled independently on each material. So, for example, here you can see that the texture fades out on his face a little bit earlier than it fades out on the rest of his body. So that's it for Edge Breakup. I'll talk very briefly about just a few of the other details that made the look work. Getting those unified shadow shapes. So this is like a straight Lambert shaded, version of the scene, and this is what would be kind of input into our post-processing. And then we filter that with some very, very simple, blur and threshold operations to create shadow shapes that have like softened, rounded corners. To add in the edge darkening effect, we basically use those same blurred versions of the texture, and then we break up some of the transitions with a kind of a half-toning operation to get these the broken up texture on the gradients. And then that gets used as a blend between a lit texture and a shadow texture on every object in the scene. And those lit textures and those shadow textures can be art-directed and hand-painted, so you can have details that appear in the shadows but not in the lit texture, or vice versa. And here's how that looks when it all comes together. And if you pay attention to her hair and her cheek, you can see some of those indications of texture on there. And the shaders also have color and saturation controls that can be applied independently to the lit and shadowed colors. And that gives us the control that we need to really achieve the full range of moods that we're going to need for the story to match the concept art. Just an example of, another example of using metatexture in context on the ocean. So here's the geometry for the ocean. It's very, very low resolution. Each of those quads is about 60 or 70 centimeters across. And we use something we call the bathic map because depth map was taken. That basically controls the color based on the depth of the ocean and the level of illumination. And then we dither that using a texture that's a hand-painted texture swatch that we use metatexture on. And then we add in some sky reflection and fog, both using the same map, so you have a kind of a unified color scheme. Add a little bit of sea foam on the upwind sides of the waves, film grain, specular highlights from the sun, and then here we push the base mesh downward near the boat, or near the viewer, and we suppress the texture on that so that we can add more detailed geometry for things that need to have interaction where there's a wake splashing up, or ripples, or other kinds of splash cards. And we use that same seafoam texture on some of those effects. And then all that gets covered up by the boat, so you don't actually see it unless you lean out over the edge. But so we use metatexture on things like the bow waves here. And obviously used it on the entire ocean. We use metatexture on things like splash cards. So this is a way of kind of having our cake and eating it too, where we wanted to have hand-painted textures because we have these wonderful production designers who paint these very specific styles of splashes, but we also wanted them to break up in an organic way and not look like cards. And so this is one of the methods that we used for that. We also use metatexture on things like this kind of custom shader for bubbling, roiling water as the ship is sinking. And here's how all those components look when you piece them together. You can see the very, very low-res ocean with the surface, with the texture suppressed, and with all of these extra decorative elements added on top. So we're at 20 minutes, and I can wrap it up here. What I was going to wrap it up with was just showing the trailer for the show, about 45 seconds.
This world has no use for an old sailor. And I was supposed to be alone.
Well, you're not alone.
Thanks a lot.